Okay, everyone. So we all hope that you had a wonderful lunch, and thank you for the speakers that spoke in the morning. So our third speaker, I want to introduce Farid Saberi from Western University, and Farid will be speaking on hard, easy, and non-problems of absurdity, a Marxian critique of Thomas Nagel's account of the absurd.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So hello everyone. I want to start by mentioning 2 points and then jump into the arguments. Firstly, I'm a philosopher of science by training, so this is not my area of expertise. It's an excursion for me, and it's a paper that I wrote a year or so ago, and I have had it for a while, not really having the courage to go for publishing it, so I'm hoping I get a lot of pushback and criticism in a way that I could modify or rewrite the paper in a way that is more appropriate to be published. And yeah, given that it's a careful examination of a specific argument by a specific philosopher, namely Thomas Nagel, I normally rely on slides more. For this specific talk, I just thought it's best to focus on my notes and read from my notes. Perfect. Okay, so it's not working.
What should be the arrow, I think?
Oh my god.
Oh, there.
Okay, so the contemporary analytical philosophy literature on meaning of life has flourished recently in an interesting way, and they distinguish between naturalist and supernaturalist and objectivist from subjectivist approaches. Meaning in or of life is usually understood as this final self-justifying goal that makes sense of a person's life's narrative or the human project more broadly. The concept of meaning of or in life and its distinction or overlap with concepts like well-being, happiness, virtues has been explored in useful way in the philosophical literature, including in the work of, if this work doesn't seem to be, people like Macpherson, DeBras, and Metz. Supernaturalists in this literature usually believe that non-physical entities like God and soul are necessary or conducive to articulating a coherent notion of the final goal. Naturalists find supernatural entities or properties unnecessary or even harmful. Subjectivist holds that the meaning of life or in life will have a strong mind-dependent properties, while objectivists prefer a more mind-independent account of meaning or of highly ranked goals in life. There have been some attempts to bridge the gap between objectivism and subjectivism by proposing some sort of intersubjectivism or socially constructed objectivism in works of people like Brugard-Smith, 2005, and Wong, 2008, and more recently by Macpherson. Yet this literature, this landscape of the literature that I just described, leaves some areas, it seems to me, less explored. Firstly, the distinction between folk and philosophical notions of meaning of life and absurdity. In his 1970 paper, Thomas Nagel, called The Absurd, introduced a distinction between folk, conventional, and philosophical notions of absurdity and proposed different treatment for each. His distinction was shadowed later on in the development of the literature, where the method of conceptual analysis tries to specify necessary and sufficient condition of using the concept. It concerned itself with how the term should be used rather than how it is used in different social contexts. As we will see, distinguishing between these different aspects or problems of absurdity a la Nagel serve as a useful tool to disentangle aspects of the question that might otherwise remain confused. Another aspect that remains underexplored in the literature are the social and historical roots and conditions that kind of give rise to the experience of how people in their life experience meaning of life, goal of life, and absurdity. Late Enlightenment figures like Hegel and Marx really highlighted how conflicts and exploitation in civic or class societies very much mediate people's experience of alienation and absurdity, but that kind of gets sidelined or shadowed by more analytical treatment of the question, which treats the question of absurdity or meaning of life as an eternal problem for an idealized individual. So in this paper, I try to address these two less explored area. I will defend a version of socially constructed objectivism through a critical discussion of Tom Nagel's view of absurdity and the meaning of life. I argue that Nagel is right to reject folk articulations of absurdity, but wrong to conclude that absurdity is universal, internal, and inescapable. I draw on Nagel's distinction and distinguish between hard, easy, and non-problem of absurdity. At the same time, I go beyond Nagel's subjectivism about meaning and absurdity by proposing a socially mediated notion of rationality and justification that turns ad hoc, arbitrary, final goals of life into a non-arbitrary ones. So to do this, first in section 1, for about 5 minutes, I'll just discuss Nagel's account of absurdity. Then I discuss for 8 to 9 minute problem with Nagel's account, and then I'll jump to my proposal. I hope I have the timing right. All right, so Nagel began his account by criticizing folk arguments for absurdity of life that view human life as absurd due to its cosmic insignificance. The argument from insignificance or minuteness takes two forms. Firstly, the argument from minuteness are things like what matters now will not matter in a million years. Humanity is insignificant in the vast cosmos, and the human life is fragile and always threatened by death and accidents. And these arguments kind of are supposed to show that human life is meaningless. Nagel contends that none of these entail absurdity. Significance, he argues, is not logically tied to permanence or scale. Something can matter now without needing to matter forever. Likewise, a finite life is no less capable of meaning than an infinite one. Length alone does not confer value. Nagel's response adopts a secular naturalist subjectivism. Human goals matter insofar as humans take them to matter. A second folk argument is that life is absurd because every action or goal is justified only by another action and goal, and this forms an infinite chain with no ultimate end. Nagel replies that life contains short-term self-justifying aims like relieving a pain, helping a child, attending an art exhibition. These short-term self-justifying goals do not require being embedded in a single overarching teleology. And against these folk articulations, Nagel introduced his own diagnosis. Absurdity arises not from cosmic facts or chains of justification, but from a structural tension in human cognition or psychology. Humans are capable of, first, seriousness, taking their project as important and engaging practically in life, and second, reflective detachment, stepping back and seeing their justification for those serious projects as contingent, arbitrary, and open to doubt. Because reflection can always question the ground of our commitments, and because this reflective capacity cannot be turned off, seriousness and skepticism coexist. We must act seriously while recognizing that our commitments to these meanings to the things we call self-justifying goals of our life lack ultimate justification. This mismatch for Nagel is the philosophy called universal and inescapable absurdity of human life. The philosophical absurdity for Nagel differs from conventional absurdity, where there are some contingent unfortunate events that take away some goals or probability of reaching some goals in our personal projects. For example, consider a superstar football player who has a career-ending injury and lost the chance of participating in an activity from which they draw a lot of meaning and motivation. Nagel thinks that there is nothing philosophically interesting about conventional absurdity of this football player. Universal and philosophical absurdity, on the other hand, is not absurdity of a specific situation, rather the general inescapable absurdity of the whole human life. Nagel's philosophical absurdity also differ from Camus. Camus located absurdity in the conflict between human aspirations and an indifferent, hostile world. Nagel claims that Camus is not pessimistic enough. Even if the world satisfied all our desires, the reflective standpoint would still destabilize our seriousness. The absurd is eternal, internal, not dependent on the external world. So let's turn to Nagel's proposed treatment for philosophical absurdity. So folk absurdity is not serious for Nagel. Conventional absurdity is not interesting, it's just a contingent accident. And what is interesting for Nagel is philosophical one, and his treatment for it is we cannot avoid reflective detachment. So Nagel rejects escapism as impossible because you cannot turn off the ability to be reflective. He rejects asceticism, that is avoiding taking life seriously, as self-defeating. If you want to take life not seriously, you're taking not life taking seriously. So you are taking something seriously. So it is self-defeating. And he also condemns or rejects Camusian heroism, that is a defiant confrontation with the fate, as romantic self-pity. Note that Camus also condemns escapism. He holds that the solution is to acknowledge the absurdity and the failure of human life and still affirm defiance in the face of this fate. These supposedly give us a certain novelty and authenticity. This for Nagel is too romantic and self-pitying, quote unquote. Instead, Nagel defends a stance of irony, embracing both seriousness and doubt without despair. Irony acknowledges arbitrariness of goals without abandoning commitment. It is a modest liberal attitude grounded in epistemic humility. For Nagel, even if God or any other higher being or goal exists, we still have to choose them through an arbitrary and epistemically ungrounded process. So that's about a rough characterization of Nagel's account of absurdity. Now let's turn to the problems that I find with this account. Nagel's picture is elegant, but I argue flawed in at least three ways. First, folk absurdity does not always fail. Nagel is too quick to dismiss folk intuitions about minuteness or insignificance. It's true that our modern speech community can separate significance from cosmic invariance, but this conceptual secular capacity is not naturally given or timeless conceptual truth. In many pre-modern cultures, concepts like meaning and truth were inseparable from divine permanence. For example, in Arabic or in Persian, the concept truth, haqiqat, and the concept meaning, ma'na, are come from the same words with the same origin, like spirituality. So these concepts are highly intertwined. The medieval Persian poet Omar Khayyam, also a famous mathematician, logician, and astronomer of his age, of the golden age of his time, for example, repeatedly dwells on the absurdity of human life due to its finitude, not because he failed to grasp a logical conceptual point, as highlighted by Nagel, but because within his conceptual world, his speech community, significant presupposed some sort of cosmic resonance. What modern analytical philosophers treat as a conceptual truth was for him a culturally embedded insight shaped by a different linguistic community. We are living in a modern age like Nagel, and hence we can have a secular concept of meaning and absurdity that Khayyam and his contemporaries could not have. However, this does not mean that they were conceptually wrong. Rather, Khayyam's specific linguistic and conceptual tradition could have enabled him to understand some other aspects of human condition that is not easily accessible to our modern sensibility. This is relevant when I later on introduce the hard problem of absurdity. Okay, the next problem with Nagel's account is his account of chain of justification. It is correct that there are short-term goals, so it is correct as far as it goes, but again misses the point of why lay, non-philosophically minded people experience absurdity in their daily life. The problem is not that people suffering from folk absurdity lack meaningful short-term or mid-term self-justifying goals. Rather than in a modern capitalist society, these goals are chosen or imposed and pursued within an alienated social relation that distort justification, if there are any justification. In the first book of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that human use actions as means for a higher good, and the candidate for this higher good could be different things. One candidate he seems to favor is eudaimonic life realized through polis, that is a virtuous, rational, harmonious, and just political community. Marx extends this Aristotelian eudaimonic view and vision. He remarks in his Grundrisse, published in 1858, that quote, humans are zoon politikon, that's a term from Aristotle, political animal, not merely a gregarious animal, but an animal which can individuate itself only in the midst of society. It is in the light of this vision that one has to understand his notion of alienation. Marx argues that capitalist alienation turns the life of the species into means of individual life. First, it estranges the life of the species from individual life, and secondly, it makes individual life in its abstract form the purpose of the life of the species. End of quote. For example, considers someone who thinks becoming a successful and wealthy banker is the ultimate goal in life, and then at moments of self-doubt, they contemplate how arbitrary, biased, and absurd this self-justifying goal it is. This experience of absurdity is socially mediated. They have set this goal for themselves without collective rationality of the political community, and following it leads to exploitation and deprivation of others from their life chances and flourishing. Capitalism, in this regard for Marx, is a machine of absurdity and nihilism, because it gives abstract individuality, that is unbridled egoism of some social groups, like the greedy banker in our example, the social power to shape social life in significant way. For Marx, the right and balanced relationship between these two individual and species aspect would be when, quote, in the place of old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonism, there will be an association in which free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So, what is wrong with Nagel's account is that we do not just subjectively choose self-justifying goals. We end up choosing it as social animals, political animals in the midst of a political community, and if the political community is deeply flawed, is not working, then we end up finding the self-justifying goals not really genuine and more or less arbitrary. Finally, what Nagel's called philosophical or universal absurdity is not eternal or inevitable at all. Justification for short-term or long-term self-chosen goals become arbitrary when pursued in isolation. Human experience shows that socially generated forms of rationality and collective justification feels more stable and authoritative than individuals one. For instance, Helen Longino, a feminist philosopher of science, in her Fate of Knowledge, a very famous book, it's published 2002, this argues that scientific objectivity and certainty arises from collective process of knowledge production and justification within a well-structured, inclusive scientific community. Scientists therefore avoid existential dread about the certainty and reliability of their knowledge. They trust it to the extent that socially mediated human rationality and certainty allows. Likewise, I argue, members of Marxist humanist and rational political community could be confident that their self-justifying goals are not ad hoc or arbitrary, but as justified as socially mediated rationality permits. In Marxist humanistic picture of just and flourishing society, humans do not follow their interests and talents one-dimensionally. Rather, they stay multidimensional. So what Nagel's call conventional absurdity and misfortune is not immediately absurdity unless it is mediated by an unjust and unequal social world. For example, an injured athlete could still be a pianist or a novelist. Thus, conventional absurdity dissolve under a deliberatively just and rational social conditions that allow for multidimensional growth of human talents. Other misfortunes could be tragedies to be mourned without making life absurd. So, Nagel's supposedly universal absurdity becomes a non-problem, or at most an easy reformable problem, produced by capitalist, irrational, and exploitative social arrangements. So, it's not that inherently our chosen goals are arbitrary forever. If we have a rational community, political community, we could rely on our deliberatively chosen final goals as non-arbitrary. So there is no deep philosophical problem here. It's basically a non-problem. And if you want to make self-justifying goals that if you want to make self-justifying goals that shape society not to be ad hoc, then we should make sure that justification behind them is deliberative and collective. Perfect. So I'll try to be faster. Now let's go and kind of discuss my own proposal. Adopting David Chalmers' famous distinction between hard and easy problem of consciousness, I propose distinguishing between three problems of absurdity. First, the non-problem. Nagel's philosophical and universal absurdity arising from arbitrariness in justification. In a socially rational community, this is not existentially troubling. Second, the easy problem. Socially mediated absurdities, nihilism, alienation, generated by class society. These are genuine but reformable. And finally, the hard problem, or what I call Khayyam problem of absurdity, cosmic fragility and human finitude, what Nagel's called folk absurdity. Even in a flourishing society, human projects remain vulnerable to contingency, say an asteroid hitting the Earth and destroying it forever. This fragility is not existentially destructive, but calls for humility. Properly understood, cosmic insignificance is not a threat to meaning, but a source of wonder and humility. As I understand it, Khayyam's hard problem of absurdity cannot be dissolved by a simple logical maneuver, as Nagel thinks, in our linguistic maneuver. In our modern language, we have the conceptual capacity to talk about secular meaning of life. Still, it is conceivable for us to use the term significance and meaning of life in a way that it implies an expectation. an expectation that we find just, virtuous, and flourishing human life resonating with nature and the universe, and this life will not be abruptly disrupted by mere natural accidents. This hope or expectation is a legitimate one. This awareness of finality and fragility is not an obstacle in the way of our social process of justification of noble goals. Rather, it will inform the process. Thus, the hard problem of absurdity is compatible with eudaimonic flourishing, while the easy problem is the real side of struggle. So, yeah, I'm almost done with my time. I probably just summarize by saying that my proposal is straightforward. Do not waste energy on Nagel's non-problem, and do not despair over the hard problem of cosmic fragility. The real task is addressing the easy problem, that is, the social structure that prevent collective rational deliberation and thereby generate modern absurdity. And I kind of try to introduce a notion of socialist humor as opposed to liberal irony in the conclusion that I don't think I have enough time to go into. Hopefully, if it comes up in the Q&A, I'll be happy to address it, and if not, then feel free to email me. I could share the draft, and I would be happy to receive your comments. Thank you.
Do you want to do your own
Yeah,
questions?
of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks so much for that. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your discussion of Marx. So I like this idea that, or I guess I can use the example you use of the banker, right? So this banker, or in general, right, for Marx, the laborer is kind of alienated from his own work. And in the case of the banker, this banker maybe is good at banking, is extremely greedy, but for some reason then realizes that maybe their work is actually meaningless, that the ends they're seeking aren't really sort of contributive to any flourishing. And I was just wondering if you considered some things that Nietzsche says about that, because I kept thinking about it. So I read Nietzsche in The Gay Science and Twilight of the Idols, sort of suggesting that when we're confronted with this problem, what am I supposed to do with my life? He seems to come up with this sort of really romantic solution where our goal is to sort of create this aesthetic object from our own will, and it's sort of supposed to sort of transcend the real, and this transcendence sort of beauty that we experience through the aesthetic object of our own creation sort of makes everything worthwhile, kind of. What do you think of an idea like that as being a solution to this problem of absurdity, especially as related to work, where I hate my job and I need to do something, but so I decide to use my own means and create some sort of aesthetic object that's supposed to represent the sort of transcendent understanding I have of the world. Do you find Nietzsche's solution?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah. So that your question presupposed that the argument that I presented about how a Marxian view will approach it was at least understood. So I'm happy. And then you introduce a new element, Nietzsche. I think as someone who comes from like a socialist background, right, there was always like some sort of hesitant and multifaceted approach to Nietzsche. Some leftists like Deleuze kind of tried to appropriate Nietzsche for a leftist camp, and some others like Lukács consider him like a ultra-right, like a fascist, or the kind of precursor to the rise of fascist philosophy, especially in a very, very great book called The Destruction of Reason. Lukács systematically discusses Nietzsche as a precursor to later on Nazi and fascist philosophy. I tend to take side with Lukács on this. I don't think we be too inspired by Nietzsche would help here, and I think Nietzsche suffers from the same problem that Camus is suffering from. That is kind of trying to make the idea that somehow we face absurdity in life, and somehow we find out that the goals that we somehow set for ourselves if we have a chance, or it's imposed on us, is bullshit. Like the fact that we are following them, there's always this voice inside us that, what the heck are you doing now? Like, and Nietzsche is kind of trying to make that aesthetic that, oh, try to live your life, that if you are supposed to relive your life ever and ever, you will do it the same thing. So that doesn't address the deep question that I think late Enlightenment figures, that's why I'm using the term late Enlightenment. I consider Marx and Hegel still in the Enlightenment period, and Nietzsche and other people as like this modern era of cultural criticism and philosophy. So I think they were aware that it's not eternal, it's not in the nature, it's not a cultural curse, it's not the curse of Christianity coming to its final destination. It's just the social world and specific social relations operating in a specific way that is amenable to descriptive sciences called capitalism. And if we could just limit or change capitalism, we could like set goals that seems more reliable to bet your life on, say in like justice. I'm gonna dedicate my life to justice, not to become a banker. And I live in a society which values justice, which most rational people in a deliberative conversation have come to the conclusion that, yeah, actually it is worth the time and the trouble to dedicate your life to justice, or to become a creative artist, or to fighting fascism. These are not arbitrary. What I really hate about Nagel's account is that at the end of the day, it seems that if when someone is fighting fascism, Nagel would say, okay, your goal is justified, but always know that it's arbitrary. You know, it's just, if you were born differently, if you had come across different people, then you would have not ended up choosing fighting fascism as your goal. And then it's like, no, dude, like it's objectively, as far as objectivity mediated by human mind is concerned, fighting fascism in a specific era is the most meaningful thing you could do with your life. There is no way you could convince me that fighting fascism is just like another hobby. So that's why liberal irony doesn't work, especially if you live in a society that faces the rise of fascism. You have to have a certain luxury to consider everything with irony. So that's kind of my long answer to your question. I hope I did.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Any other? Yes.
Yeah, this might be, again, outside your own kind of purview, but I'm kind of wondering, just to clarify about what the hallmarks of liberal irony are like. I wonder if you can maybe comment on, like, it seems uncomfortable, like you know, when I think of the history of philosophy and, you know, figures that have to do with irony, Socrates especially comes up. So I wonder, does Socrates for you fit into this mold of the liberal ironic philosopher?
I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
I think irony, the way, as much as I understand it, I'm not an expert of ancient philosophy, but the way that irony works in Socrates is this very creative, rhetorical, and critical thinking tool to kind of fight the established ideologies of the polis, of the city that a philosopher belongs to. It's kind of one way of bringing philosophy and critical thinking into the streets, at least the way that I think I understand Socrates. But I don't think the irony that Nagel talks about is the same irony. The irony of Socrates is a liberating irony because it's kind of defies the established wisdom, but the Nagel's irony is kind of psychologized, internalized irony. You mock yourself. You don't take yourself seriously. Socrates was like, let's not take what we are told by the established rule seriously. Here we are like, oh, don't take yourself too seriously. If you think you want to dedicate your life to become a greedy banker, do it. As long as you care about it, it's a meaningful goal. But don't take yourself too seriously. Like, had you been born in a different country, or your mom, I don't know, read you different stories before night, then you would have found something else as meaningful. it's not totally justified, rationally grounded. And if you are dedicating your life to become